BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, everybody. Today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Wednesdays, I talk to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about Jack the Ripper. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Blackbox Ned. On this episode of Ripper Wednesday, I would like to talk about the murder of Annie Chapman, because Jack the Ripper has 5 canonical crimes that have been attributed to him, and they are the murders of Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Liz Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Kelly. And the murder of Annie Chapman is the one that I've discussed the least here on Ripper Wednesday, so I would like to devote this segment to her case. And I'm going to be looking at several different sources. I think the murder of Annie Chapman is a very telling part of the mystery. It's a very revealing part of the mystery because the murder of Annie Chapman occurred on September 8th of 1888. And this is one where we actually began to know that there was a Whitechapel murderer. After the murder of Annie Chapman, people realized that there was indeed a serial killer that was operating. The Whitechapel murders began in the spring of 1888 with the murder of Emma Smith. Then there's a rather substantial gap in time until August 7th of 1888 with the murder of Martha Tabram, and some people thought that there were connections between those two cases. Then there's the murder of Polly Nichols on August 31st of 1888, and people are again beginning to speculate. It seems like there could be a single serial killer, but at that time, people were not 100% certain. It's really after the murder of Annie Chapman on September 8th of 1888 that people realized that most likely, almost definitely, the same person murdered Polly Nichols and Annie Chapman. The murder of Martha Tabram is still highly, highly debated. Some people insist that that was Jack the Ripper, and other people insist that that was not Jack the Ripper, and that was just an unrelated killing that happened to take place approximately 3 weeks before Polly Nichols was murdered. But with the murder of Annie Chapman, this is also very revealing because she is the victim of Jack the Ripper, who was murdered at the closest to sunrise. We're talking about between 5 a.m. and 6 a.m. on September 8th of 1888. Polly Nichols was murdered at some time between 3 and 4 a.m. And I know these are very, very large windows. Some people would absolutely have my head on a plate if they even heard me saying that there's this 1 hour time frame. Of course, it's a smaller window than that. I'm only saying that because the times of the murder are still disputed. But yes, Polly Nichols is murdered between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. on August 31st of 1888, and then with the murder of Liz Stride, which occurred on September 30th, she was murdered at approximately 12:58 a.m., close to 1 a.m. And then the murder of Catherine Eddowes also took place on September 30th of 1888, and she was murdered at sometime between 1:15, 1:30, 1:45, and if we're going to use these very broad estimations, sometime between 1 and 2 a.m. on September 30th of 1888. And Mary Kelly was murdered indoors, so I think that her case is very different. So what I think this reveals is that, this is actually just my take on the subject. You can dispute this with me if you want. I would love to know your responses. But I think that this shows that Jack the Ripper is doing this out of convenience. I don't think that he had a perfectly fine-tuned method. I don't think he knew about the perfect places to look for people, or else there perhaps would be a much more consistent time frame. I think that he was simply going out with the intention to murder, and that he was looking for women in vulnerable places, and sometimes it would take him all night. Maybe he could find a victim at 3:35 a.m. Maybe he could find a victim at 5:45 a.m. He is doing this purely in the dark of night, and he's getting very close to sunrise with the murder of Annie Chapman, but I don't think that this is suggesting that there's some type of enormous, specifically designed plan about the times that the Ripper is committing these murders, the locations that he's committing these murders. I think that this is just somebody who is an opportunistic serial killer who might not even be talking and having conversations with the women, because that's one thing that I really go back and forth on. I think that there's a case you could make that Jack the Ripper's walking up to the victims and he's asking them to come with him, or you could say that Jack the Ripper was just hiding in the shadows and a woman walks by in a vulnerable place with no witnesses around, so he stabs her and then begins to mutilate her. But with the murder of Annie Chapman, we can see that this is a crime that is very different than the murder of Polly Nichols, because specifically the mutilations began to escalate And one of the books that I've been reading is I, Ripper by Stephen Hunter, and there's a very detailed section on the murder of Annie Chapman. And because it's called I, Ripper, he's trying to get into the thought process of the Ripper. It is a novel, but it's very well written. Maybe some of you guys have heard this before on Black Box Online Radio when I've said I was at a writer's workshop once, and one of the presenters said, if you want to be a writer, do you like sentences? And that might sound very cheesy, it might sound very simple, but it's about enjoying wordplay and creating the structure of the sentences. And I think that Stephen Hunter is very good with that. But he pays very specific attention to how Jack the Ripper would have intentionally escalated the amount of physical violence that was used on Annie Chapman. And also, I think a big difference is that with the murder of Polly Nichols, the killer may have been interrupted by Charles Lechmere, who's also known as Charles Cross, who goes on to become a Jack the Ripper suspect himself. And with the murder of Annie Chapman, it feels like that there is a larger amount of time that the Ripper could have spent with her body, and that she could have been mutilated more extensively for that reason. But this also shows a growing tendency to create more violence. This is another time when the Ripper is doing things that he hasn't done in the past. Even if he committed the murder of Martha Tabram and the murder of Polly Nichols, he is now taking trophies from the victims. And the one that's discussed in the book, I, Ripper, is actually the 2 brass rings that Annie Chapman was reported to have worn. And I haven't talked too much about that because that is still disputed to this day, whether or not the Ripper actually took those. Maybe they were already gone, but there were marks on Annie Chapman's fingers that showed that she may have been wearing 2 brass rings. And you might be thinking that those sound like wedding rings. And Stephen Hunter did put that in the book, I, Ripper, that he believed that the Ripper stole her wedding rings. And I was also watching a video on the Jack the Ripper Tour channel recently, which I did a response to, that featured Steve Blomer, who's the author of the book Inside Buck's Row. And he said that would be completely normal because Jack the Ripper would go on to become a serial killer that would take trophies from the victims. And he would take things like organs, as horrible as that is, most notably with Annie Chapman, her uterus. Now, there's another story that is also discussed in different places on the internet, and I'm not even sure if I should bring this up because I know it's not a scholarly response, but I remember reading years ago about how there were 2 coins that were placed by Annie Chapman's body. Again, this is just going off of stuff that I read online, but I am sharing with you guys the way that I remember it. And that the 2 coins are placed equidistant from her body, and that somebody was trying to incorporate that into a psychological profile by stating that that indicates that the Ripper was experiencing some type of psychotic episode, and he was trying to conduct his own type of personal ritual. It was ceremonial to him, but he was doing it for a psychotic reason, because he is murdering and mutilating a woman. Maybe he thought that he had some type of mangled reason within his own consciousness about why he should have done this, or he could have actually been experiencing a psychotic episode that did not have a logical reason. He would actually just see a woman break out into a fit of rage and then lose awareness. Some killers even report blacking out when they are committing these types of murders. But I would like to look at the website Whitechapel Jack that is going to talk about the timeline in the murder of Annie Chapman. And this is 5:15 a.m. on September 8th of 1888. A young carpenter who lived at number 27 Hanbury Street, named Albert Kadash, went into the backyard, probably to use the lavatory. He reported hearing a woman saying no and the sound of something falling backwards against a fence. At 6 a.m., John Davis, the occupant of number 29 Hanbury Street, prepared to go to his job as a carter for the day. His apartment was on the front of the 3-story building that housed multiple families. It had a small backyard that was easily connected to Hanbury Street by a 20-foot passageway, which meant that trespassers, including prostitutes and their clients, would also frequent the place, and there were also frequent nuisances to the 17 residents of number 29 Hanbury Street. But already you can see from the timeline here that Albert Kadash, he actually walks out at 5:15 a.m., and as I recall, it may be that might be completely correct that he was using the lavatory. He goes back inside, and if I recall, yes, he does walk out again at 5:30 a.m. to leave, and then we have the body being discovered at 6 a.m. And I was also reading about this online, that it's just rather shocking that Annie Chapman may have been dead for about 30 minutes before she was found, a very substantial amount of time, which meant that the Ripper could have spent a very long time mutilating her body, way more than the 8 to 10 minutes that he would have had with Polly Nichols, if some of those estimations are correct. So it's not a surprise that the mutilations are more extensive to Annie Chapman, and that they're going to get even more intense as the Ripper is going to be escalating his activities. So we're going to talk about the discovery of Annie Chapman's body. When he descended the stone steps into the backyard of number 29, he was met with a mutilated female body that was sprawled between the steps and the neighboring fence. He noticed that her skirt was pulled up to her groin, and without further investigation, he ran into a neighboring street to call for help. He flagged down 3 workmen, James Green, James Kent, and Henry John Holland, who took one look at the body and then rushed to find a constable. They soon came upon Inspector John Chandler of H Division in Commercial Street, and they said, "Another woman has been murdered." And this was turned into a newspaper headline, "Ghastly Murder in the East End, Dreadful Mutilation of a Woman." And this will also be the foundation of the leather apron suspect, about how somebody who is referred to as Leather Apron may have been responsible, but I'll talk about him in just a second. I mean, I just think, though, that this is displaying that this is the dawn of Jack the Ripper. Or let me take that back. I'll take that back. This is the dawn of the Whitechapel Murderer. Jack the Ripper was a name that was found on the Dear Boss letter that was mailed on September 27th of 1888. With the murder of Annie Chapman, this is when it shows that there was a real serial killer operating, and even the papers are reporting that another ghastly murder happened in the East End. So let's go back to the article about Annie Chapman. Annie Chapman's family life and loss. The victim was another Whitechapel prostitute by the name of Annie Chapman, and she also used the name Dark Annie. Annie was born to George Smith and Ruth Chapman and had 3 sisters. In 1869, she married John Chapman at the age of 28 and worked as a coachman in other positions. They had 3 children, Emily Ruth, Annie Georgina, and John Alfred, and they had a happy life for a short period of time. But then there were tragic events that took place. Emily Ruth died of meningitis in 1882. John was born disabled and surrendered to a charity school for care. And possibly due to these tragic strains on their marriage, both John and Annie became heavy drinkers. Annie was arrested several times for public drunkenness in Windsor, and a public report blamed her for drunken and immoral ways. And then her marriage ended around 1884 or 1885, and then her husband John died in 1886 because of cirrhosis of the liver. So definitely a tragic story. And also, Annie Chapman was 47 years old, considerably older than perhaps like Jack the Ripper's final victim, Mary Kelly, who was in her 20s at the time, which, again, I think goes back to the Ripper not choosing the victims because of their age. I think he's choosing the victims because they are women, and this was done for convenience. But this will tie into a set of claims that has been made by Hallie Rubenhold, who was the author of the book The Five, and she claims that Annie Chapman, most notably, was not a prostitute because she would have been in such poor health that she wouldn't have been able to work that profession when she was murdered. If anything, she was a frequent drinker who was out on the streets. Now, that has been disputed by a lot of people, and you guys know my stance on that book and the claims made by Hallie Rubenhold. I don't think they're too important in regards to the Jack the Ripper case, because no matter what the women were doing out there, they didn't deserve to be murdered by Jack the Ripper. They didn't deserve to be murdered by anyone. They didn't deserve to meet these tragic fates. So that's where I leave it at. And I understand someone would like to write the definitive authority and the definitive account of the victims of Jack the Ripper from a historical perspective, but the whole social justice angle on it just didn't sit well with me in The Five. But I even have a response to an online presentation that was made about it called Jack the Ripper, The 5 Forgotten Women, which you can listen to here on BBO War. And specifically, it's a response to the YouTube channel Debunk File, where someone's giving their own take on the subject. But they did rely heavily on Hallie Rubenhold's book, The Five, as a source. So let's also look at some of the other claims that have been made, or even more so than claims, some of the other facts that have been reported on about the murder of Annie Chapman. Another book that I've been slowly working through is Jack the Ripper, A True Love Story by Win Weston Davies, and he has chapters on all of the canonical victims. He spends the most time talking about the murder of Mary Kelly because Win Weston Davies was actually the great-nephew of Mary Kelly, but he also included this statement here from Dr. George Baxter Phillips, who made these descriptions of Annie Chapman's body on September 13th of 1888. And this is something that has been shared in numerous places online. I'm just reading the text from the book Jack the Ripper, A True Love Story. The left arm was placed across the left breast. The legs were drawn up. The feet were resting on the ground and the knees were turned outwards. The face was swollen and turned on the right side. The tongue protruded between the front teeth, but not beyond the lips. The tongue was evidently very swollen. The front teeth were perfect as far as the first molar, top and bottom. Very fine teeth they were. The body was terribly mutilated. The stiffness of the limbs were not marked, but was evidently commencing. He noticed that the throat was dissevered deeply, that the incision through the skin was jagged and reached right around the neck. On the wooden paling between the yard in question and the neck, smears of blood corresponding to where the head of the deceased lay were to be seen. There were 14 inches from the ground and immediately above the part of the neck. The instrument used at the throat and abdomen was the same. Very important detail. It must have been a very sharp and thin, narrow blade, estimated to have been between 6 and 8 inches, probably longer. He should say that the injuries could not have been inflicted by a bayonet or a sword bayonet. They could have only been done by such an instrument as a medical man would use for post-mortem purposes. But the ordinary surgical cases might not contain such an instrument. Those used by the slaughtermen, well-round men, might have caused them. He thought the knives that were used in the leather trade would not be long enough to deal with the blade. There were indications of anatomical knowledge. He should say that the deceased had been dead for at least 2 hours, and probably more when he first saw her, but right way to mention it that she was fairly cool, and it was also a cool morning, and that the body would appear to cool more rapidly from it having lost a large quantity of blood. There was no evidence of a struggle having taken place, and he was positive that the deceased entered the yard alive. A handkerchief was found round her throat, and a handkerchief was found around her throat of the deceased when he saw it early in the morning, and he should say that it was not tied after the cut to her throat. So some major points here. Annie Chapman's tongue is sticking out because most likely she was asphyxiated prior to the stabbings, which shows that Jack the Ripper is very focused on mutilating the women. And I think, though, that we have to remember that this is not the time when the witnesses have found her body. When he said that thing about how she had been dead for at least 2 hours, I mean, she probably had been dead for about 30 minutes based on some of the estimations that we have just talked about. But this is very, very important when people are trying to construct a certain set of theories, when people are actually trying to figure out what was happening with Jack the Ripper back in 1888. And so many people point toward multiple killers, and they also say that multiple knives were used. So as we're going to go through different stories here on Ripper Wednesday, it appears that one knife was used for the incision to her throat, and that same knife was used for the incisions to her abdomen, and the person seems to display some type of anatomical knowledge. Now, that does not mean for a second that Jack the Ripper was a doctor, and those comments there, which is an interpretation of George Baxter Phillips' writings, is that there could be other professions, like a butcher, who would have been familiar with anatomical knowledge in a similar way. But the fact that the 6 to 8 inch blade, which could have even been longer, maybe 9 inches, could have been responsible, and that was something that a medical man may have carried. There are so many other possibilities about how and why someone could be carrying that knife. I mean, for example, the Jack the Ripper suspect, Francis Thompson, worked in a facility that made those types of instruments, that made surgical instruments, and he was practically the quality control inspector. We also have people like Chaim Hyams, who was a cigar maker, and he's just cutting up tobacco all day. Now, you did hear that line, though, about how someone who would have worked as a leather craftsman, a leather worker, might not have had the knife skills to pull this off. So a cigar maker, that's a strike against him, I think. But anyone who had worked in the butcher trade, like Jacob Levy, perhaps, who has become a very widely discussed suspect, I've noticed that over the last 2 years that there have been more and more discussions about Jacob Levy, and even people who are considering Jacob Levy as a Jack the Ripper suspect might have another type of suspect. They might have another theory that they're going with. But as we go through the stories here on Ripper Wednesday, we have to pay attention to that because some people insist that multiple knives were used. For example, Randy Williams, who is the author of Sherlock Holmes and the Autumn of Terror, states that the majority of the crimes were committed with a 6-inch blade, and the murder of Liz Stride was committed with a 9-inch blade, and he takes that to the bank. And you even heard there that the knife could be 6 to 9 inches, so that could easily be explained. I mean, these are based on estimations. And the one that I was talking to you guys about recently was Patricia Cornwell, who's the author of the book Portrait of a Killer, and she talks about how a blade that was used was called the Indian Pesh Cobbs, which was a curved Indian blade, so that would account for the discrepancies in the measurements. I don't think the curved blade was used, and as of now, if I can be very frank, I primarily think that Jack the Ripper was using one knife and that there was one single killer, and I think that for a couple different reasons, but I do have conditions, and the biggest condition is that the murder of Mary Kelly might have been completely different because Jack the Ripper just had so much more time with her body, and she was just mutilated so extensively. but perhaps we're going to have to do a whole episode just on the different types of blades that could have been used. And right now, it's a little bit difficult to make that determination looking at Annie Chapman's case individually. What I think we do learn from this is that Jack the Ripper was escalating in violence, where we should call him the Whitechapel Murderer at this point. He is escalating in violence. I think the same person murdered Polly Nichols that murdered Annie Chapman. I think he did this because he was uninterrupted. I think he was extremely swift, and you can even read about that in I, Ripper by Stephen Hunter. And this thing about Albert Kadash hearing the no when she's pushed against the gate, I think those were her last words. I think that the Ripper was extremely fast with the blade, and Annie Chapman may not have suffered extensively. So, I mean, I think that we're going to really have to focus on one killer and one knife until we have enough convincing reasons to look at an alternative possibility. But I would love to know what you think about Jack the Ripper. What do you think about the victims? What do you think about the story of Annie Chapman? What do you think about the Jack the Ripper books that I've been talking about? Is there another Jack the Ripper book that you would like discussed here on Ripper Wednesday? And I would like to remind you guys that you can download this show for free on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and iHeartRadio under the names Black Box True Crime or Black Box Podcast. And that will be all for me now. You guys know where to write the show, blackboxonlineradio@AOL.com. There's also blackboxned88 on Instagram and TikTok. And I will see you next time.